welcome to Empire with me, Anita Arnhem.
And me, William Davenport.
Now, you know what? I know we've had an astonishing response to some of the programmes that we've done. And some of them are lovely and you're very, very kind. And some of them are a little cranky, which is fine. You're allowed. But what I've been really touched by is the number of people who've sent emails that start off with, what? And one of the
and there've been quite a lot of those.
One of the big what bags was about the slavery of people in England and, you know, ships coming up to Essex and Stepney and Cornishmen.
And great chunks of Ireland.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because so much of, you know, the conversation about slavery is, I mean, if you're in Britain, I think it depends where you live. If you're in Britain, it's Wilberforce. Everything stems from Wilberforce.
You know, if you learn about slavery, it's almost always in the context of the Brits being the saviours.
Yeah, that's right.
The white saviours coming in, swooping in, stopping this terrible practice.
Absolutely. And, you know, and you've got, you know, I remember illustrations from children's books, you know, where you've got ships swooping in and taking the slave ships and liberating the men who are under decks. And there is a real security blanket of goodness and heroism, you know. And in America, that is all, the security blanket is Abraham Lincoln coloured, you know, and Abraham Lincoln flavoured, and it's the Civil War. And look, you know, this is a country that was divided and folded in on itself because the concept of slavery is so abhorrent to the winners. This book that we are going to talk about today, and we are really very delighted that the author of this book is with us today, has challenged so many of the things I thought to be true, and I was comforted.
I knew very, very little of what I read in this book, and I was horrified by my own ignorance reading it.
Yeah.
Also, I have to say, I was just astonished by the beauty of the prose and how moving it was, how personal it was. I wasn't expecting to be as moved or as charmed as I was, despite the fact it tells some very, very difficult truths.
I know, it basically fed both of our hungers, me for God, didn't know that. And you for, well, weeping. I think we've established you're a weeper. But listen, without further ado, let me tell you who we've got with us. We have Kris Manjapra with us. He's a professor of history at Tufts University, author of Black Ghost of Empire, The Long Death of Slavery and the Failure of Emancipation. And maybe for some of you, there's a little tinkle going on. I recognise the name. That is because, do you remember the news story that came out? And it was huge. It was huge. Suddenly it was disclosed that only in 2015 did Britain pay off the interest of the debt it took on to pay the slave owners from slavery. Not the slaves. We're talking about reparations. There were reparations, but they were to the slave owners. The man behind that research was you, Kris, wasn't it?
That's right.
I mean, let's just, first of all, blimey. And second of all, how did you do that? Let's start with the thing that people will know about you.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's great to be with you. And, you know, I think the work of the historian is a little bit like, you know, stumbling around, sometimes through archives, sometimes on the web. And this was a question of stumbling around actually on the web. And it was in 2018, actually. I was just reading some government reports through HM Treasury. And in one of kind of the footnotes, I noticed that there was a mention of the Compensation Act that was finally paid off in 2015. And I thought, that's not possible. They can't mean the one that ended slavery, not that Compensation Act. And in fact, it was that. And, you know, the number of Freedom of Information Act requests were filed. I filed them. And through that, we basically uncovered what happened, which is exactly this 180 years that British citizens were paying through their taxes for that act of 1835.
For compensating slave owners.
Yeah.
For compensating slave owners. That's right.
I do remember at the time thinking, you know, but all of the mood music in Britain at the time was move on, just move on, get over it, move on. This is in the past. And I thought, HM Treasury's not moving on. Well, you know, we're still paying that debt.
Yeah, and what's interesting is at the time, Prime Minister Cameron had just been in 2015 in Jamaica and had in a public speech said it's time to move on from this ugly history. But that came some months after this final payoff had happened. And so whether that was coordinated or not, you know, it is the case that the moving on really had not happened until 2015, at least if we want to look at, you know, debt legacies, that was a continuing outpay of the British state for this compensation Compensation Act to slave owners, like William just emphasized, which was decided on and begun in 1835.
Well, shall we go back to brass tacks here? Because your book, it talks about ghost lines rather than red lines in history, ghost lines, and the fact that, there are things that you can't move on from because they haven't ever been addressed. Let's start with the very etymology of the word emancipation, because I was really fascinated by that and how politically loaded a word can be.
Sure. Emancipation, of course, comes from Roman law, and so its roots are in Latin, and it basically means to free from the hand. But whose hand? And it's the hand of the slave owner. And basically, emancipation laws, even back in Roman times, where, of course, we can talk about ancient slavery, were laws designed in favor of the slave owner in order to allow them, of their own will, if you like, to free from their hand their enslaved people. And so emancipation laws, and it's actually baked into the word itself, are created for the slave owners, but not for the enslaved. And that's precisely, what started happening from the 1780s onwards when emancipation laws began to spread across the earth.
So, Kris, in the series that we've had already, we've had a variety of different kinds of slaveries already. We've been talking about ancient slaveries. We've talked about different kinds of slavery in the Islamic world, even in India. But what was different about the Middle Passage? What was different about the industrialized export of vast numbers of black Africans to the Caribbean and the New World?
Yeah. In answering that question, I think it's good to first take a step back and pause to recognize that we're dealing with systems of slavery that are, in fact, in terms of their scale, relatively equivalent. So what I mean by that is there are about 12 to 15 million people who were transported against their will across the Atlantic. There, in fact, are about 12 to 15 million people who were transported against their will across the Indian Ocean over the course of, early modern and modern history. Then we could talk about the slavery across the Pacific Ocean, of which that's a huge story as well.
I'm just taking in that figure. You're talking about black African slaves sent as slaves to India.
This would be, yes, black African slaves sent to...
This is like what they call the Habshis here in India.
Absolutely.
Working for the Deccan Sultanates, taking Ethiopians and selling them in the Konkan coast, the west coast of India. It's that scale. It's a comparable scale.
It's of that scale, very much organized by the Omani Empire, organized across the transit points of Zanzibar. Very much a history that we need to focus on more, and we need to know more about. And
this is Tipu Tip and the slave owners of Zanzibar.
And what era? Just remind people what era
only in the
1890s,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and the beginning of the 20th century.
And even more extraordinary, I understand that slavery was only banned in Oman in 1970 after
That's
Sergeant
right.
Pepper.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
In our own lifetime.
In our own lifetime. So we're dealing with some really long trajectories here, and we're dealing with slaveries which, we don't want to, argue that one is worse than the other, because in fact we're dealing with coercion, we're dealing with human misery,
yeah.
Grave oppression. But to answer the question of, why focus on one of these systems and create explain the difference with the others. The Western slavery, what I'm going to call, what we call Atlantic slavery, that had a couple unique features. Number one, even more than what happened across the Indian Ocean, we have the obliteration of family ties. We have the destruction of the abilities of people to connect or to return to their roots. And that very much is what the New World experience of enslavement has been. It has been the obliteration of those family ties. Beyond that, we have an economic system that is distinctive, and we can talk about capitalism, and we can talk about racial capitalism and industrial levels of enslavement. And so the means by which people were enslaved, the purposes that they were being put to use, the sugar plantation operated very differently, for example, than a spice plantation, just in the extremeness of the oppression, the amount of time that people had to work. So all of it, it's really a question of the degree of slavery and also of this obliteration of family ties.
Could you go into that? What would the difference between, say, growing pepper and harvesting pepper vines somewhere in
and sugar
India.
and cotton, which
and
is
what is different about sugar? Why is it so much more?
We could maybe boil it down to say that the production of sugar operated by an industrial clock, and that was not by the modern clock. And in fact, in Barbados, they started putting up clocks on plantations and punishing and torturing slaves if they did not produce a certain amount of yield by the time that the plantation owner had requested. So this kind of time-based exploitation was unique to slave to sugar production. And another dimension that I would say is the ways that families who were enslaved, their children were often treated as, well, slaves were treated as property, first of all, but then the children were treated as property. And when children are treated as property, it means that they can be divided, as property can be divided, and sold on to new owners in ways that tore the families of enslaved people apart. And that, kind of property ownership of enslaved people was very extreme in the West.
And breeding programs.
Yeah, the way that enslaved people were seen as property and were seen as alienable property, chattel property. And therefore, it was part of slavery to alienate children from their parents, children from their mothers. And that happened much more in the Atlantic system than it did in any other system in the world.
One of the, a lovely thing about the book, and it's not lovely, it's the wrong word at all, but a very powerful thing is how you talk about these great concepts and then you will focus in on a particular story. And I was deeply touched by the story of James Mars, who seems to exemplify this level of, it's a cruelty that I can't even fathom how human beings can imagine it to begin with. Can you remind us about tell us about the James Mars story?
Yeah, James Mars was a young man who was enslaved in 1790s in Connecticut, so Connecticut being New England, the northeast coast of the United States. And this was during the time of the emancipation in Connecticut. And, part of the book, the point of the book is to show that emancipations were a lot messier than just an end to enslavement. And so as emancipation was happening, James Mars was technically freed, but what freedom meant at that time was that he had to in fact stay as a bonded laborer for all of his youth.
And we should say, and he was a child, he was a child. So his parents were slaves. And we'll talk about this in more detail. But emancipation meant that his parents, because they were already slaves, they couldn't be freed. And he could, in theory, but not yet.
So that's absolutely right. So his parents could not be freed. He was freed, but he had to wait, more than 10 years. He would have had to wait more than 10 years to obtain his freedom at age 18. And so he was removed from his parents. He tried to run away as this indentured laborer. He was an indentured laborer. He tried to return to his parents, and
they move closer to him. I mean, they're so powerless. They try at least to be close to the child that they love.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And throughout all of this, he basically suffered whippings, imprisonment, torture, until he finally reached the age under the Emancipation Act in which he became a free black person. And then he spent the rest of his life, as a black abolitionist, writing. He wrote a biography, his own autobiography, but then he became a very important spokesperson against the American system of slavery. And I think that, for me, was really powerful about researching my book, which is the ways in which we don't focus on the black abolitionists, the people who experienced slavery.
They didn't figure it at all.
Hardly, right? Because we have the narratives that are very kind of in some ways iconic, but they happen to be familiar and comfortable stories. And to come to one of the deep themes in the book, black abolitionists did not only ask for their freedom, they always asked for a reparations.
Yes.
They always asked for repair. And the question then becomes, did they get it?
Now, you mentioned this was in Connecticut, and this is during the emancipation period. And this was a shock to me, that because we always have this theory, well, emancipation happened, a light was switched on, people realized they were being dreadful and that this could not go on and everything got better. But first of all, that's not the case anywhere, and particularly not in America. So the first place to...
I mean, that is literally, you're not exaggerating, in those movies, like the Wilberforce movie with Benedict Cumberbatch. There's great cheering in the House of Commons. Ping,
everything will be fine.
Everything ends.
But it is not the case. Yeah. And in America, you really beautifully map out how and where it starts. And it does seem to start in Philadelphia. We're talking sort of 1780s, aren't we? The germination of this idea of emancipation. And it wasn't a bing even then, was it? Whoa, what were they talking about? It's the not yet. And it's a line from Hamilton. You've seen Hamilton? Have you both seen Hamilton?
Yeah.
So you've got, sort of Washington, John Lawrence is saying, he's led the first sort of black regiment. And he's saying, can we have freedom now? And he says, not yet. And not yet is at the heart even of this Philadelphia experiment. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we go back to Philadelphia, not far from Pennsylvania, not far from Connecticut. That's where we get to what I would call the ground zero of abolitions. And in fact, we can trace how something detonated in 1780 in the Pennsylvania legislature and then really kind of expanded to other parts, not just of the Americas, but of the earth. Specifically, what began there was a form of freeing enslaved people that was not really about their liberation, but was about the continuation of bondage by other means.
And how did they do that? I mean, it's if you imagine that once you say, okay, you're free, that's it. Go forth.
Yeah.
Be happy. Why was not that the case?
Yeah, so here it was about creating laws that ensured that people who were technically freed in terms of law, had to nevertheless serve as unpaid laborers, as bonded laborers for long periods of time. So we were talking about the children again. So black children were freed after 1780 in terms of the letter of the law, but the letter of the law also said that they had to wait until a particular age 18, age 25, age 27, it depended according to the state, until they could truly be free people.
And
until then, they had to work.
Free.
And correct. And
so what was the difference? What was the difference between slavery and that?
So here, there is no difference, right? I mean, here, what we're really saying is enslavement continued after legal freedom. And that's how these laws were constructed.
Kris, tell me about the motivation for the act being passed. When I've read about Wilberforce, I've always understood that it had a lot to do with evangelical Christianity and the evangelical understanding that an enslaved person couldn't choose Christ freely. And therefore you were doing it not in the sense as a human rights thing, but as a Christian missionary thing. Is that also the case in the States or not?
There is definitely a story about religion and religious thought here. And, it's a complex story. So in other words, since the 1600s, Quakers who were very much in power socially in Pennsylvania and specifically in Philadelphia, they were some of the early abolitionists. And some of that early abolitionism was coming from their belief that all human beings are created equal under God. So, to a certain extent, there was this really inspiring kind of early abolitionist moral compass.
Yeah.
Although equally, some of the biggest slaving families in Bristol and the early British slaving stories were the Frys and those families that were involved in chocolate trade and so on.
See, again, that's shocking to me that they're involved in slavery, because they always seem to be the good guys.
When we look at how people work and how people work in history, often motivations are very mixed, and two things can be true at the same time. So there was definitely an inspiration of the moral. They were inspired by a moral compass, but at the same time, there were economic interests that were involved. There were interests by slave owners, Quaker slave owners, to if freedom were to happen, how to in fact ensure that they maintained the upper hand. And that many of the folks who were on that Pennsylvania legislature in 1780 were also Quaker and were inspired by these Quaker ideals. But that did not mean that their motivations were pure. And I should also say the key here, and this is one of the keys that came up throughout the research for the book, is that when you don't have the people who are subjected to the oppression, i.e. the enslaved people, as part of the decision-making group, commenting on whether this actually looked like freedom or not, then you really are skewing the debate so that it's going to be in the interest of those who have the power, who were the slave owners.
Part of this too? I mean, you've got slave revolts taking place, most famously the Haiti one, which William Blake reads about and is very excited about in London, and writes great poems and draws pictures of it. Is fear of slave revolts a big issue here or not?
I think it definitely is. It's really interesting to look at this moment, 1750s, 1760s. Two things are going on. Number one, we actually have imperial competitions that are taking place to unprecedented extent. So the Caribbean region, of which slavery plantations, this is their epicenter in the world. This is also the time where we have the Spanish, the French, and the British fighting, a kind of a 18th century world war.
And swapping islands.
And swapping islands. So that's happening, creating a lot of anxiety.
St. Lucia goes from the French to the English, back to the French.
That's right, exactly. And at the same time, we have the beginning of some very intense slave revolts. So the Macandal revolt that takes place in Haiti in the 1750s, the Taki Rebellion. We have the Maroon Wars. We have in the 1790s the outbreak of what would become the Haitian Revolution.
And these are special because there's not some sort of white abolitionist who's coming in saying, I give you your freedom, I release my hand. But this is people saying, this is ours by right and we're taking it.
Exactly. And so
doing so violently in a way that frightens people.
And doing so violently. And so this is creating, however much we may want to talk about Wilberforce. Wilberforce is coming in I don't want to call it the wake. It's really, he is coming amidst the storm of these revolutionary attempts. And what we have are states, governments, imperial governments who are trying to answer the question, how do we try to survive the storm? And the survival of the storm is emancipations, trying to relieve the pressure that's taking place in the colonies as in the enslaved and revolting.
Free market thing going as well, that free people can work harder than slaves. Is there an argument made on that basis, or?
That's a beautiful point. And of course, that's the great Eric Williams thesis. In one part of his argument, who was an economist and also became the Prime Minister of Trinidad, was that you actually see an economic logic to moving from slavery, which is actually very economically inefficient, to moving to wage labor.
If the slaves are dying in large numbers through mistreatment.
That's right. And particularly when we add to that kind of the ecological story, which is that the sugar plantations were becoming less productive over time. The soil was being, leached of its nutrients, and production was diminishing in the West Indies, and we have sugar production that's beginning to rise in the East. And so there's also a move of capital towards the East. And so slavery is not as good a business. So it was a good time to get out of slavery.
But also this middle ground that they're trying to find to please everybody and keep everybody quiet and stop everything erupting. The essence of the freedom that they're granting. I'm looking back at that. What was free about it? You didn't have land. You didn't know where to go. You were sometimes working for 10 years or more without any kind of money. You had no vote. You had no say. I mean, what exactly was the argument from the abolitionists to say, your life is now better, well done, congratulations, us?
Yeah, well, that's such a profound question, because the direct answer to the question is, for the abolitionists who were in charge, the empowered abolitionists who were creating these problematic forms of quote unquote freedom, emancipation meant you are no longer to work without pay, even though that, as we're saying, was very complicated because people were still forced to work without pay. But your question is pointing to a deeper meaning of what freedom is, which is having relationship to land, that you have an autonomous relationship to your land, having a relationship to your family that you can be in charge of.
Family is a crucial thing, being able to have family ties.
Having family ties. I mean, we can call this sovereignty, right? That's fundamentally what sovereignty is being able to control your story, your culture, your relationship to your relatives.
Or to just to love and not have your love interrupted. Simple things.
And when we look at what, again, the black abolitionists of the 1780s and 1790s were asking for, yes, it was freedom, but freedom was the start. It was the first request. And after that came the true request, which is give us land, give us the ability to reconnect with our families. So there was already a demand there by a number of freed people to be able to return to their families in Africa. Many of them knew their families, just in their youth before being transferred on slave ships. So they wanted to return home. And, and so these are some of the deeper meanings of what freedom meant, in addition to asking for compensation. right? Asking for an actual financial compensation for what had been taken from them. And then, of course, when we look at, for example, some of the abolitionists writing in London, black abolitionists from the 1790s, they're also asking for an apology. For an apology from slavery.
Equiano?
That's right.
We obviously, Anita and I both come out of Britain, so very familiar with Equiano.
Yeah.
Are there many equivalents of him in the Caribbean?
Well, there is a kind of a group of folks at the time. So we think of Olaudah Equiano. I also want to mention Ottobah Cugoano, who was also writing from London at the time, and he was a colleague with Equiano.
Equiano was in Essex, in Cambridgeshire.
That's right.
East England.
That's right.
I've been to his grave, I remember. Yeah.
That's right, absolutely.
Just outside Cambridge, I think.
And they both, and Ottobah Cugoano actually in his writing uses the word reparation, that what is required now is a reparation in the aftermath of slavery. But then there's some, another interesting figure, and there are many as we can mention, but I want to mention the name of Robert Wedderburn, who was born in Jamaica, came to London, was born of a slave owner and an enslaved African Jamaican woman, and was this firebrand, in the early 1800s in London, writing back to Jamaica saying it's time to start the revolt. And then in terms of the black community in London, trying to organize the community for social justice,
We're going to have to take a break here, but when we come back from the break, I'd like us to talk about a little bit later on, because I think some people are aware of, what is it, 40 acres and a mule, or this idea that there was a gifting for certain reasons later on after emancipation. And just what does it mean now? The move on, nothing to see here. Join us after the break. Welcome back. We are here with Kris Manjapra, who is, frankly, blowing our minds and blowing a lot of myths out the water. Can we talk about how, even after, so-called emancipation, this carrot is sometimes dangled in front of black people that, okay, you don't have land, you may not have land, but if you do something for us, we might give you something.
The book, when you look at the book, you'll see that there are kind of these 5 types of emancipation that we can discern over the course of a whole century of emancipations taking place. We've talked already about one of them in great detail, gradual emancipation in Philadelphia. But another major type is what we can call war emancipation, the kinds of emancipations that happened in the aftermath of a war that was being fought. In fact, when we start talking about the Civil War, that was a big war emancipation in the 1860s. But the precedent was in the 1780s and the 1790s. It was in the context, for example, of the American War of Independence. We had emancipations taking place. The British promised that if enslaved people would fight on their side, as their compensation, they would receive their freedom. The Americans promised the same thing. And so we had large, significant numbers of enslaved people not just fighting the opponent, but fighting for their freedom through their role in the infantry. And so we have, these war emancipations in the 1780s.
So we should say that the corridor is really important. And I think, Kris does it really well. So these people who do, they come good somewhat. They dump a whole bunch of people and they say, right, go Nova Scotia, go be free, be happy. But there's no land. There's no money to build anything on the land. There are already people in Nova Scotia who don't like these newcomers.
That's right.
And therefore, that's when these people decide
That's
life
right.
can be better. Tell us what happens after that when life is made so unpleasant for them in literally the promised land. What do they do?
So this is in the early 1790s.
So the Brits have lost the War of Independence. You've got a lot of people moving northwards.
That's right. We have the British colony of Nova Scotia. We have previously enslaved people who had fought on the British side, who, as their compensation, are being sent to Nova Scotia. And from Nova Scotia, as you were just saying, finding that there's hard scrabble there. There isn't a life to be had. Also experiencing the racism of the settlers who were already there, and then being moved or being offered to depart for Freetown, Sierra Leone, which became the first emancipation colony on earth.
So the idea is you move the black African freed slaves back to Africa.
You move them back to Africa, not to anywhere close to where they came from,
where their families are.
But to a new colony. The British had established a new colony there, which would be a place for them to potentially create their own life. Now, the problem here is, of course, that the way that these emancipation colonies worked is you had this first group of the freed people who came, who kind of actually died quite quickly because they were not given the support needed. There were, health issues, there were infections. So that moment did not produce a stable kind of colony. But because you had this emancipation colony idea, the British now, by 1806, declare the abolition of the slave trade, what was called the abolition of the slave trade. In other words, the actual shipping of enslaved people was to be abolished. And through that, you had slave ships that were captured being taken to this new emancipation colony in Sierra Leone. But interestingly, here we come back to this idea of how messed up emancipations were, because once the enslaved were led off the slave ships into this quote-unquote emancipation colony, they had to still serve 14 years as bonded laborers, basically continuing their life as enslaved people before they could be quote-unquote trained up or prepared for their freedom. And so this idea that Black freedom was in fact only possible through Black debt, by Black people paying a debt, is the only way that they could be freed from slavery. That deep idea, which is actually one of the deep logics of racism, which it still exists today, defined what happened in Sierra Leone, and it actually began to spread. So there were many other, St. Helena, parts of the Caribbean, Bahamas, there were...
Liberia
later became these kind of emancipation colonies.
Kris, you mentioned a century of emancipations. Can you just give us a brief sort of chronology of what you mean by that?
Yes, if I can provide a bird's eye view, it would be, we talked about the 1780s, which was the Philadelphia moment, gradual emancipations. By the time that we get to the turn of the century, so the 1800s, we have the opening up of these emancipation colonies, for example, in Sierra Leone. But we also have, very importantly, a new kind of emancipation process, the retroactive emancipation, I call it, that took place in Haiti, whereby Haiti fought its own liberation war, but then in order to be recognized in international law, had to pay a massive reparations to the French imperial state. So that was a new mode of emancipation.
And they paid.
And they were forced to pay, and it took them until the 1940s to complete that payment. So it was the beginning of third world debt, really, that we're seeing there.
The 1940s.
The 1940s. All of these debt payments that we're talking about have very, very long kind of trajectories.
Yeah.
Right?
I study imperial history. There's so much of this I didn't know, and I'm sure that people listening will know.
And can I just say that?
Even less.
And isn't it the case that this is making the point that our present is connected to our past? If we just want to look at it in terms of financial terms, these debt legacies connect us to this past. So we have the Haitian moment. Then we move to almost the classic moment of compensated emancipation. The British Empire invents this, and it becomes the model, the gold standard, if you like, for compensated emancipations between the 1833 and 1838 in the British Empire. Many other empires, the French, the Dutch, the Swedish, the Danish, they all then in some ways copy what the British do, which is to do two things. They first pay financial compensation, a money payment to enslavers. And on the other hand, they require that enslaved people pay through free labor for a period of time, through indentureship. So they're providing enslavers a double compensation.
What sort of length of time are we talking here?
Anywhere between 4 and 12 years, and even in some cases a little longer. So, for example, the Dutch have a 10-year indentureship. The British wanted a 12-year indentureship, but through political mobilization, it was reduced to 4 years.
Yeah, but only after a while. If it was like 12 and 8, then 4, it was like, it wasn't done willingly or easly.
That's right. And and 4 extra years of having to pay through bonded labor is 4 extra years of oppression. And there's a lot of torture that was being used. And we could talk about these new torture techniques like the treadmill that were introduced precisely at that time. So we move from that compensated emancipation moment and its invention in the 1830s to what I call the war emancipations of the Civil War, the American Civil War. And the war emancipations already, they have a precedent that they were following. And these war emancipations were marked by freeing enslaved people who fought on the side of the victor. So we know that, of the 400,000 enslaved people across the South, a vast number of them were the reason why the Civil War was won, because in a variety of ways, whether through active mobilization or through civil disobedience, they were part of the reason why the North won the war. They received their freedom, but war emancipations did not pay a compensation to those who were emancipated. They were simply given their freedom, but in some ways they were, hung out and expected to
get on with their lives,
to get on with their lives without with no reparations that followed. And the American case then, in some ways, descends into a very sad story of Jim Crow and that trajectory that begins from the end of Reconstruction.
Explain
onwards.
that for those who don't understand what Jim Crow means.
Jim Crow is a kind of what I think of as a dirty war against black families that was fought through legal and extra-legal means. So think of the lynching campaigns, but also think of the...
When do they begin? I mean, in my head, that this is sort of Martin Luther King territory, and you're talking about an earlier period, presumably.
Yeah, and what historians show us is that the lynching campaigns began right in the aftermath of the Civil War. So from the end of the 1860s onwards, in places like Mississippi and Alabama, we have these quote-unquote extra-legal vigilante projects or programs to disenfranchise black people.
And when does Ku Klux Klan appear? Again, this is the cinematic sort of vision that we have of bonfires and white hoods and so on.
So we're seeing that emerge really in the 1870s. As early as that, and really consolidating from the 1890s onwards.
Yeah, but I mean, you're astonished by how early it was. I cannot believe how late this has been a thing. So one of the most moving things I've ever seen was in the African American Museum in Washington. They have moving footage in the 1920s of an entire sea of white hoods marching on Washington, marching up to the White House. It fills the screen for a good 2 minutes. You'll see these hoods going past. So this is not so long ago. I mean, if we think the rise of Hitler is pretty contemporary, this isn't much earlier than that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
William, I'm telling you, the whole place filled with marchers.
And, I know this was, for our American audience, this is going to raise the blood temperature of some of the viewers. But when we so easily demonize, and of course we should, the Ku Klux Klan and American white supremacists, but ultimately what they are saying is, we want our property back. It's framed in terms of property, that there was a property that was stolen from them. In this case, it's a property of people, of enslaved people. And here we have, the big ongoing wound in the United States, that there are groups of people who feel that something was done to them or done against them because their property in other human beings was taken away. So, that's the war emancipation of the 1860s in the United States. And then that leads to the final main type of emancipation that actually begins almost simultaneously with this, which I call the conquest emancipations. And the conquest emancipations really take us back to Africa. So here we have the British and the French, the Belgians, the Portuguese, other groups, other imperial powers who now, because emancipations have expanded across the Americas, claim a kind of moral high ground and say that they are going to bring emancipation to the Africans by conquering them, by conquering their states. And so it's a very...
And breaking up sort of Tipu Tip's slave thing in Zanzibar and so on.
Correct. Yeah, so it's a cynical move. I mean, it's a mixed move. There is there is of course some good that's coming from their interventions, but it's coming along with a lot of devastation.
And Livingston is taking on these sort of these Arabian slaving groups operating in East Africa, isn't it?
And in fact, Christian missionaries, in justifying their expansion in Africa, are often doing it in terms of abolitionism, right? But here again, that abolitionism was done very much to African communities and not with African communities. And that makes, again, all the difference.
I'm going to say to you what people are maybe shouting, some people shouting at their radios. Stop making me feel bad. This was a long time ago. What do you want me to do about it? Why do you keep going on about it? And if you want reparations, who am I meant to pay?
Great. Yeah. I mean, this is the crux. Why talk about all of this? Is it a big guilt-tripping exercise? Is there something perverse about wanting to keep going back to these histories? Why can't we just move on? And I think the answer is that we actually transform our future together by transforming our relationship to our past together. And the fact is that this is a shared past, right? That all of us are in fact affected by. When we transform our relationship, I'm going to call it heal now, when we heal our relationship to that past, which involves not suppressing, repressing, forgetting, pretending that various things did not happen, but when we invite it into conversation and then we wonder about what our relationship to our past is, that actually helps us to come up with some new, more productive, more peaceable ways of thinking about our future together.
Truth and Reconciliation Committee, in a sense.
Well, maybe that's kind of what it is. I kind of feel like we keep refighting the same battles because we don't retell the history that we share, and so that's really the crux of why we need to revise our history, because we're in a rut currently. But
revising history and truth and reconciliation don't come with a price tag. Is it important to have the price tag attached to this, that there should be some financial recompense, or is that not as important or important at all?
It is important.
To whom does that recompense go?
Since the financial benefits of slavery and then the financial benefits of the abolition of slavery went to enslavers, it is the case that what reparations involves is the reversing of that, the redressing of that. And I think, money is symbolic. Money is material, but money is symbolic. And there is an argument to be made that there needs to be a compensation to the families of enslaved people, to the descendants of enslaved people, both for material and for symbolic purposes.
Right.
But I would also add that can only be one part of what a larger discussion around reparations is.
Okay, so the other thing that often comes up when this subject is raised is that, okay, why are you looking only to the white people for reparations and only for the guild? And you will have heard this, without the King Dahomies of this world, who captured people and sold them to white slave owners who then took them across the Middle Passage, none of this would have been possible. Why aren't you looking to his lot? And you must have heard all these things.
All these big forts on the West African coast in Ghana and so on.
This could not have happened
locally gathered slaves
without complicity.
Which are then sold to Europeans.
So why just blame us and make us feel bad?
What I find really interesting and inspirational is that when we look at grassroots activists in Africa today, I'm thinking about grassroots folks who I'm in touch with in Ghana, they're actually looking to their social elites for reparations as well. So
really?
I don't
so
think
it is happening. It
absolutely,
is happening.
And I think these are interconnected because, in fact, the oppressions that we see of the people in post-colonial nation states in Africa and the continuities of political oppression by social elites, that is directly related historically to the origins and then the continuation of slavery. It is a question of social elites and how they connect across, imperial, national, racial boundaries. And that's what we need to be addressing.
And one other defensive reaction to this that you'll often hear in a British context is, should we start suing the Italians for the Romans crucifying Boadicea or
or go back to France and punish them for the Normans? And, there's all of that comes up.
Well, the question is how far back do we need to go? I guess I would ask a question in response. Do we honestly feel that we've moved on from this history? I mean, when we look at the fact that, I look at my own family, my third great grandmother was enslaved. That's not that long ago. Slavery and its implications for the future for our contemporary society is very clear. We look at when we want to talk about land, we look at, African either African American or African Britons, their access, their relationship to land is gravely unequal to other groups. Or we look at representation in the media, or we look at health outcomes. Along all of these different, the social determinants of health, as we call it, we see that New World African people, I'm talking of the Americas, and Black people in Britain, are still suffering. And that is what we need to understand in a historical perspective. And that's where the reparations discussion is. I think the true reparations discussion is not about how much money do we cut a check for. It's about how do we address social disrepair. And I think there are really exciting and inspirational ways to do that. I think it's an inspiring discussion. I don't see it as a disheartening discussion.
I can't think of a more appropriate place to leave this. Kris Manjapra, thank you so very much for being with us. There is only one episode of Empire this week, so do join us again next Tuesday. Until then, it's goodbye from me, Anita Arnon.
And goodbye from me, William Davenport.